Today's daf we're going to learn is Chagigah Daf Gimel. This is the daf for Shabbat. Today's daf is sponsored by Tracy Ackner for Refuah Shlema for Shifra Hadassah Bat Chana and Shimon ben Tzipora. Okay, we're going to get started. We were in the middle of this topic of, remember, everyone is obligated in Olat Riyah to see Pnei Hashem, to go to the temple, bring the sacrifices, but not, right, the whole question is, do we include, not a cheresh? The question is, and some others, but right now we're talking about someone who's deaf. Does deaf include medaber ve'eno shomea, shomea ve'eno medaber, right? Someone who hears but doesn't speak, or speak but doesn't hear. So we said they're actually obligated. Then we brought a braita that seemed to say otherwise, they're exempt, to which we reread the Mishnah. When the Mishnah excluded the category of a cheresh, what it meant was everyone is chayav in re'iyah and simcha, except for a deaf person, one who hears but doesn't speak, one who speaks who doesn't hear is exempt from the korbanot, the sacrifices of re'iyah, of the what we call the burnt offerings of the re'iyah, but they are obligated in simcha. So we come up with this middle position. Soon we're going to see why that is. And then they brought a braita to prove that akol, that's at the bottom of bet and bet, akol chayavim b're'iyah b'simcha. Everyone is obligated in both seeing and the simcha, right? Those two types of sacrifices. Except for this one category, right? These people who are exempt from riyah, right? So we said these people who aren't both deaf and mute, but only either deaf or mute, they are obligated in the korbanot of simcha. One who's both a deaf and a mute, vish shoteh v'katan, we'll get to what a shoteh is at the end of today's daf, p'turin af min simcha, they're exempt even from simcha, ho'il u'p'turin mikol mitzvot ha'amorot b'torah, because those people are exempt from all mitzvot. So they're exempt from everything, but the person who's deaf or mute, but not both, is not actually exempt from all mitzvot. They're just exempt in this case from the riyah, they're not exempt from the simcha. So now the obvious question, why, when it comes to re'iyah, are they exempt? And when it comes to simcha, they're obligated. There's a special drasha by re'iyah that we're going to learn out from what we call gzera shava, where we compare. Same word appears in two places. We're going to say what's true for one is true for the other. We're going to learn it from hakel. What's hakel? Once every 7 years, at the end of the Shemitah year, which is exactly the year we're in right now, we are told, and you look in Sefer Dvarim, chapter 31, verse 10, Moshe tells them, Miket Sheva Shanim, at the end of 7 years, at the end of Shnat HaShemitah, B'chag HaSukkot, so Sukkot after the Shemitah year, Bivo Kol Yisrael, when all the Jews come, Le'ra'ot et Pnei Hashem Elokecha. So here you have the same exact wording of le'ra'ot, to appear before God, b'makom asher yivchar, in the place where God chooses, meaning that's where the temple is. Tikrat Torah azot neged kol Yisrael ba'oznehem, read the Torah to the people in their ears. We're going to get back to this later. Hakel ta'am, gather the people. That's why it's called hakel. Ha'anashim v'hanashim v'hataf, men, women, and children. V'gercha asher b'shavecha, and the stranger in your midst, meaning the converts. Leman yishmeu, right? Whether this is, the truth is I didn't look. Gercha sometimes refers to converts who've actually converted to Judaism, but sometimes it refers like converts convert to Judaism are obviously part of the people, and it might be referring to what we call a ger toshav, someone who lives in the country and keeps certain things, but isn't actually a full ger. Sorry, a ger tzedek, not a ger toshav. I confused the terminology. Anyway, I didn't look at which one it's referred to here. Leman yishma'u, leman yilmadu, in order that they hear, these are going to be key words here, and in order that they learn, v'yaru et Hashem Elokechem, and they'll fear God, v'shamu la'asot kol divrei Torah azot, and then they will keep the Torah. Okay, that's what it says here. So now, what are we going to have here? We're going to learn Gamari Yari Amehakel, because it says Le'ra'ot, and because by us it says, right, we're supposed to go Le'ra'ot Pnei Hashem, to be seen before God. Dichtiv, Hakel eta'am anashim v'anashim v'ataf, uktiv b'vo kol Yisrael Le'ra'ot. That's where it appears. That's what we just read. V'hatam, okay, so that's where we get it from, because by Hakel, these people are excluded, therefore they're also excluded. In other words, they're exempt. Therefore, they're also exempt by us. So now the obvious question is, how do you know by Hakal they're exempt? V'hataminan dichtiv leman yishmu leman yomadu. Okay, it says, so you hear and so you learn. Vitanya, why did I have to say both? First of all, hearing often means learning, right? Shema Yisrael is to hear, to understand, right? If you ever look at the translation, it could be listen, could be right to listen is to understand. So why do they say both? Vitanya, the Braita says, Leman Yishma'u, Prat L'Medaber Ve'eno Shomea. Yishma'u means to hear. Obviously, this excludes someone who can't hear. U'Leman Yomadu, Prat L'Shomea Ve'eno Medaber. To learn must exclude someone who hears but can't speak. Okay, someone who can't speak can't learn. That's exactly what the Gemara is going to say. Lememra, dachilo mishtaylo gama. What? If someone doesn't speak, that means they can't learn. What do you mean? They hear, they absorb, they might be learning, right? This is always an interesting thing. When you meet someone who actually can't speak, you never really know what's going on in their minds. And one of my absolute favorite stories in the Gemara is going to come right now because it exactly highlights this point. There were two people who couldn't speak. They were mutes. They lived in the neighborhood of Rebbe. They were the sons of the son of Rabbi Yochanan Megud. Some people said they were Bnei Achte to Rabbi Yochanan. Again, maybe they were famous, right? So there was all this stuff going around about who they were. Some people thought they were his. Some people thought they were the sons of the sisters of the sister of Rabbi Yochanan. Every time he went to the Beit Midrash, they would always be sitting before him learning. They would basically be nodding their heads. And they would mumble stuff, but nobody understood what they were saying. Rebbe prayed for them, and they were healed. And all of a sudden, one day they started speaking. And now, when it turned out, they learned all the halacha. They knew all the midrashay halacha, the sifrei, the safra. They knew all of the shas. They knew everything. So it seems obvious here that just because they couldn't speak doesn't mean they don't learn. So you can't say that Laman Yilmadu comes to exclude someone who can't speak. Makes no sense. So Amamar Zutra Karebe Laman Yilamdu. You know, the Torah, the text that was passed down with a tradition for the vowels. But really, it was never written, the vowels, right? It was a tradition. So he says, change the vowels. It shouldn't say yilmadu. It should say yilamdu, which means to teach, not to learn. Now, if you can't speak, then you can't teach. Now, you might say you could teach people in some other way, but I would say the typical way that people taught was to speak. And therefore, in order to teach, well, you can't do that if you can't speak. And that's why it excludes that kind of person. Here, Rav Ashi is going to prove what Mar Zutra says. Rav Ashi amar vadai leman yilmadu hu. T'isa kadatach leman yilmadu. And he's going to say, it must be yilamdu, to teach. Why? Because if you say, it's now going to say this doesn't make sense. If you say it's in order to learn, we're going to have a problem. And what? And you're going to say, because he can't speak, he can't learn. And because you're going to say it's teaching you truth. Yaman yilmadu is to learn. And Laman yishmu is also to learn. So Laman yilmadu is coming to exclude one who can't speak. And Laman yishmu is coming to exclude someone who can't hear. But Haimi Laman yishmu nafka. If it's all about learning and understanding, well, then you should be able to exclude the one who can't speak, assuming you think one who can't speak can't learn. He should be excluded from Laman Yishmu. Laman Yishmu could come to exclude both of them because Shema is to learn. It's the same kind of thing. It's synonymous. So Elavadai Laman Yilamdu. Therefore, he concludes it must be Yilamdu to teach. Okay, next. Amar Rabbi Tanchum. So that was the whole section of a deaf or a mute, but not both. Okay, and in the end, we conclude they're exempt from Re'iyah, and that all comes from Hakel, and that's all learned out from Leman Yilamdu, again, reading it not in its typical way it's supposed to be read, but in a bit of a different way. And from there, we conclude that the person is exempt, again, from Re'iyah, but they're not exempt from the Simcha. Okay, next thing for now, I just wanted to check one quick thing. Okay, I just want to look at one quick thing. Okay, tough. Okay, next. Rabbi Tanchum. Now we're going to get to a few drashot of Rabbi Tanchum. I'm a Rabbi Tanchum, and they're going to have to do with other people that are exempt. If you're deaf in one ear, you're also exempt from this mitzvah of Re'iyah. Shene'amar be'oznehem, another drasha. Once we learned it from Hakel, we're going to learn other things from Hakel. It says be'oznehem, 2 ears. You have to have 2 ears that work. Okay, even though I know a lot of people that are deaf in one ear, and you would think they function absolutely normally in the world. It seems strange that they should be exempt. Okay, again, all of these things are really hard to understand why they exempt people. I have a few theories about it, or just a few thoughts. I think number one, just like there's all sorts of sources about women that we now look upon differently because women are in a different place in society than they were then. I think likewise, people with disabilities were treated differently in those days, right? Think about how much effort has been put into creating awareness about disabilities in our world and how hard it is. And despite everyone's attempts to try to include people who are disabled, they still have to fight all the time. And it's not so simple. So I think about way back when there was no awareness about all this. I think that those kind of people were treated very differently in society. And that might be one approach to why the rabbis think that these people are exempt from these mitzvot. You also have to remember, they're going l'ro pnei Hashem. We've talked about in general, this glory in front of God and perfection, even though we don't believe in perfection. On the other hand, in the temple, there's this idea of perfection. And maybe it was hard for them to have any of that missing there. And that's one possible approach. Another possible approach is to say that they lost my train of thought for a minute, that I totally forgot what I wanted to say. Okay, so I'll get back to it. I'm sure as I teach it, it'll come back to me. We'll get back to this idea about why the rabbis thought that these people should not be included. Okay. So now the Gemara says, what do you mean you're learning it ba'oznehem? You need ba'oznehem for a different drasha. Hi ba'oznehem, mibayle ba'oznehem dekulu Yisrael. What do you mean? It means oznehem doesn't mean their ears, each individual's ears. It means all the ears of the Jewish people. It says, do this neged kol Yisrael be'enehem, in the context of all the people to their ears referring to the people, meaning, right, my one ear maybe and your one ear should be fine. So they say, no. The fact that you can read the Torah only when you have all the people congregated, you don't need Oznehem to teach you that. You already get that from Neged Kol Yisrael. To which they say, and then Oznehem will be free for our drasha. So they say, wait a minute. You might have thought Neged Kol Yisrael would be even if they don't hear. As long as everybody's there, it's fine. Katav Rachmana be'oznehem tivihu deshame. That's why it said, you need all the people there and their ears so that they can all hear. And then the ears don't refer to one person's 2 ears, to which they say, no, hahumi leman yishma'u nafka. Now, the fact that the people have to hear, they have to have ears of the plural of the people, you already learned from the man yishmu. Why are they coming there to hear? They obviously have to be hearing. So Oznehem is still free, and we can learn from there. If you only hear in one ear, you're not obligated in the mitzvah of Riyah. Amar Rabbi Tanchum, another one. This one actually makes a little more sense. You can't walk well. You have a problem. One of your legs doesn't work. Well, you're exempt because it's hard to get to the regel. Remember, they all had to travel. It makes it much more difficult. Shnemal rigalim. They darshan it from the word rigalim. Right? Shalosh rigalim tachogli b'shana. Celebrate 3 rigalim. They call them shar rigalim. That's what we call them. Why rigalim? Raglayim. So I say, what do you mean? No, it's coming to teach you that if you have fake legs, you're not obligated. That's what it's coming to say. You need legs and not fake legs. But one person who has one leg should be included. They say, oh, no, that you learn from a different verse. Pa'amim. It says 3 times a year. Now, the word pa'amim means times, but it also means something else. Right? Like pa'am achat, pa'am shniya. Okay, but the word pa'amim also means footsteps, walk, your steps that you're taking. So they say pa'amim means your feet. How do we get that? From 2 verses. Okay, your legs will be trampled, the legs of the poor person, the legs of the poor. Okay, that says it in 2 different languages of poor people. It's poetic. Anyway, the point is it says regal and then it says pa'amim. Pa'amim is regalim. Okay, ve'omer ma yafu pa'amayich benalim bat nadiv. In Shir Hashirim it says, how beautiful are your pa'amim, which are your legs, okay? Because then it says bena'alim, in the feet of, right, or the shoes of bat nadiv, daughter of the nadiv, the prince. Okay, so now we're going to see what does this pasuk mean actually, and what do we do with this verse? So the main thing we did with this verse for our purposes is say pa'amim means leg. So pa'amim came to exclude the ba'alei kabin, and the regalim came to exclude the person who only has one leg. So again, we have another exclusion to the mitzvah. But in the meantime, Darish Ravi explains this pasuk to us, and it's going to connect a little bit to our issue, or a lot to our issue of going up on the regel. What does this mean? Much of Shir HaShirim is understood to be allegorical, right? It's a love song between a man and a woman, but it's understood to be this relationship between us and God. How beautiful are the feet of the Jews, when the Jewish people, when they go up on Aliyah LaRegel, we're talking about. Bat Nadiv, how do we get this time about us? Bat Nadiv is Bito Shel Avraham Avinu, Shenikah Nadiv. Avraham was called the Nadiv, the prince, and his daughter is the Jewish people. Shenemar, Nidivei Amim Ne'asafu Am Elohei Avraham. It says, right, the Nidivei of the Amim, the nobles of the nations gather, the nation of the God of Abraham. So Elohei Avraham, the Lo Elohei Yitzchak Yaakov. Why does it only mention Abraham in this verse? Ela, right, they bring this verse to show that Nadiv is connected with Avraham. Ela Elohei Avraham Shayat Chila Legerim. He was called the Nadiv, a prince, because he was the head, he led the early converts, right? He was the one who got people to believe in monotheism. And because of that, he's called the Nadiv. And therefore it said that how beautiful are our steps that we go to Jerusalem, the children, the daughters, actually, they call it, of Avraham. So the Maharsha makes a nice connection here, that what is connection of us going on Aliyah LaRegel and us being from Avraham? Because what did Avraham do? There were two things he did. One is he went on Aliyah to Israel, like we go on Aliyah LaRegel, and he also it was Akedat Yitzchak. He brought the first real sacrifice, right? Or he sacrificed himself, right? His whole thing to go bring a sacrifice to Yitzchak, which in the end was the ram. But the point is he went, both these things he did with a lot of excitement and interest in doing the mitzvah. And that's how, right, we go to An Aliyah LaRegel. Okay, in the midst, it's nice to talk about the beauty of it in the midst of all these people who don't have to do it. Okay, next. Amar Rav Kahana, now we're totally on a non sequitur because we brought things that Rav Tanchum said. We're now going to bring a drash of his that seems totally unconnected. One wants to try to connect it, feel free. Darash Rav Nata Rabbanit Yomi Mishum Rav Tanchum. My dichtiv abol reik ein bo mayim. This is by Joseph. He's thrown into the pit, and it says the pit is empty. There's no water. Mimash mashenamar abol reik ein yodea shein bo mayim. If you tell me the pit is empty, of course I know there's no water. Elamayim ein bo avan nechashim va'akrabim yesh bo. It didn't have water, but it had other things like snakes and scorpions. Showed how dangerous it was, for Yosef. Okay, next. Tanu Rabbanan. Maaseh b'Rabbi Yochanan beBroka v'Rabbi Elazar Chamsa shalchu lakbil pnei Rabbi Yeshua b'Pki'im. Okay, there was a maaseh with Rabbi Yochanan beBroka or Elazar Chamsa that came to greet their rabbi. This was often something people did on the holiday, kind of like to greet the God on the regel when there was no longer temple. So they would do it to their rabbi. They would go visit their rabbi. So they went to Rabbi Yeshua and Pekin. Amar lahem, he opens up conversation with him. He says, "Ma chidush haya bebeit midrash hayom." What were you learning in the Beit Midrash today? Amru lo tamidecha anu meimecha anu shotim. We're your students, and we drink from your water. And basically, we don't have anything to say, right? Almost like they're embarrassed to say what they learned somewhere else in front of their rabbi. Amar lahem, afal picheni efshar lebeit midrash v'lo chidush. I understand, but you were in the Beit Midrash. You must have learned something. So tell me. Sounds like conversation that a parent would have with the child when they get up from school. What did you learn in school today? And the kid says, "Oh, nothing." And then the parent is prodding the child to come up with something. So you'll see his questions get more and more specific. Shabbat shel mi hayta. So we start to opening conversation. Whose week was it? Remember the famous story of Rabbi Shiur and Gamliel, and they kicked Rabbi Gamliel out of the Beit Midrash, and then they brought in Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, and then they brought back Rabbi Gamliel after he appeased Rabbi Yoshua, and then they said, well, we can't kick out Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, so they did a sort of Toranut. They took turns. So different weeks, it was different, right? Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah had 1 week a month. So whose week is it? They said Shabbat shel Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah hayta. It was his week. And what did he say today? Right? He's really grilling into them, right? To get them to say something. He talked about Hakel. Now we see where we're getting to here because we're talking about Hakel. That we'll see a lot of different connections. What was his drasha about Hakel? Well, Hakel ta'am, anashim, v'anashim, v'atav. Everybody has to come, right? Men, women, children. The men, they come to learn. right? They have a chiyuv of limud Torah. Women don't have a chiyuv. And women also in those days didn't really learn very well. So the men are coming to learn. The women must be coming to hear because they don't know how to learn or they're not obligated in learning, but they're coming to hear. But but little children, what are they going to get out of this? They can't learn. They can't hear, right? They hear, but it doesn't mean anything to them. So it's in order to give reward to their parents. The parents bringing the children is already something. You can normally, right? This, by the way, some people say this is where we get the minhag to bring kids to shul because, right? The kids need to have, right? It's really for the parents to bring the kids to shul. What does it mean for the parents? I guess it's for the parents to learn that their obligation is to bring the kids into this world and to teach them and to give them, to role model for them, etc. So that's why we bring the children. Amar lahem Margali Tova Yabi Etchem Ubikashem Labdami Meni. Now Rabbi Yeshua comes and says, that's a beautiful drasha. How right? What a pearl you have. Why didn't you want to tell me that? So Odarash. Now they continue. They're warming up already. Now they start to say, Et Hashem ha'emalta hayom v'Hashem ha'emircha hayom. Right? You made God special and God made you special. So Amar lahem HaKadosh Baruch Hu Yisrael. It's a pasuk in Dvarim. So now God says to the Jewish people, now we're heading in the drasha on this. You made me your one and only. I'll make you my one and only. But where did you make God one? You say Shema Yisrael, God is one, right? God is our God, God is one. There you say, you made me one. Moving to Amud Bet, who is like your nation Israel, that is one nation in the land. So God made us his one nation. A third drasha. Okay, the first one's really talking about the family structure. The next one's talking about our relationship with God. And the third one is going to be talking about learning Torah. The words, this is a pasuk in Kohelet. The words of the Chachamim are like prodders, the prodder of like a shepherd. Kimasmerot, they're like nails that are nituim, that are really nailed in. Ba'alei asufot, okay, we're going to have to see what this means exactly. That's a hard word to translate in this pasuk, but from the people who have the asufot or the gatherers, I don't know, we'll see. Nitnu mero'eh echad, and all was given from one shepherd. So, lama nimshalu divrei Torah ledarban, right? Here it starts with divrei chachamim, and it says they're like a prodder. Why is it like a prodder? Lomar lecha ma darvan ze mechaven et hapara litzlameha leotzi chayim laolam. What does a prodder do? It prods along the cow to pull the plowing mechanism, to plow the ground, to basically make it grow, so we can plant the seeds, and then out of it will come life. So, af divrei Torah, right? This is going to be a beautiful drashot about learning and what learning does. Af divrei Torah mechavnim et lomdehem darchei mitala darchei chayim. It's basically what we call a samach chayim. It's an elixir of life. It brings life to people. Okay, the same way the prodder causes life to come. It's interesting because the prodder, it's a little bit indirect, right? It's not that the prodder actually does. It causes the cow to move, which causes the plowing to happen, which then enables us to plant the seeds. It's not like an automatic, I learn and I have life, but it's part of a process. It's a very beautiful idea. Ima darvan ze mitaltel, but wait a minute. A darban is something that's mitaltel. It's not connected to anything. It could easily get lost. It could easily get thrown away, broken. Af divrei Torah mitaltel, maybe you'll think that divrei Torah are like a darban, they're like a prodding stick, which comes and goes. Talmud lamar, that's why it says masmerot. Nails are nailed in, they don't move. So then they say, well, why didn't they just use masmero, right? Ima masmero, or you might think, a masmero ze chaser v'lo yater. Different interpretations here, I'll go with one. When you put a nail into a wall, you make a hole in the wall, and you don't actually add to the wall, because in the end, the nail is flush into the wall, doesn't jut out and make the wall thicker in any way. So, af divrei Torah chaserim v'lo yaterim, maybe you think that divrei Torah make a hole in me and don't fill me up, okay? Like, for example, if you spend 45 minutes a day learning Daf, you've used that time for something else. You've cut a hole into your day, and maybe it doesn't add to you at all, right? Maybe it just, you wasted your 45 minutes and now you lost that time. So, Talmud Lomar nituim. No, it says they're planted. It's planted. What does that mean? Maniti azo paral v'rava. It's the entire opposite. things that plant grow and bigger and bigger and bigger, multiply. Those 45 minutes add so much more to your day of learning, right? That's what learning does for you. It adds to your day. Yes, it takes up space, but most of people who are learning here will probably attest to the fact of how much you gain from those 45 minutes of learning, or whether you listen at 1.5 speed and it's less than 45 minutes. But the idea being that it adds so much to your life. Ba'alei asufot, what are the ba'alei asufot? The people who gather. Elu talmidei chachamim shoshvim asufot asufot. Okay, these are the students or the Torah scholars that sit gathering together. Now you have this beautiful vision of them all together, but wait a minute. Ve'oskim Torah, right, and learning Torah together. But all of a sudden, we're going to veer for a minute. You have this beautiful image of everybody together, but right, we're going to have to say, why does it say kulam nitnu mero'eh echad? Everything was given from one shepherd. So they want to show here the multitude of opinions. Halalu mitamim, halalu mitarim. You have those who say it's tameh, and those who say it's tahor, those who say it's impure, those who say it's pure. Halalu oslim, halalu mitarim. Those say can't do. The others say, oh, you can do. Halalu poslim, halalu machshirim. They say disqualified. They say all good. Shema yomar adam he'achani lemei me'ata. Right? This might be another reaction you have to learning daf sometimes. How am I supposed to learn? There's so many different opinions. This is so confusing. Shema yomar. Talmud Lamal, that's why it says, Kulam nitnu mero'eh echad. Everything was given from one shepherd. El echad nitanan, parnas echad amara mipi adon kol ha'masim baruch hu, right? One God gave it. One shepherd, which is Moshe Rabbeinu, right? Said it, mipi adon, from the mouth of God. Tichtiv v'yidaber Elohim et kol ha'dvarim ha'elu. So afata, so what are you supposed to do? So yes, it was all given from God. But yet there's all different opinions. So afata aseh oznecha kafar keser. We're getting back to your ears. And maybe this is the importance of having all your ears about, because you have to make your ears like a funnel. You have to listen and hear and understand what the one who's saying no and what the one who's saying yes, and pure, impure. Listen very well. Hear all the sides. And then you make your decision about which way you understand it. And that, to me, is the beauty of Torah. It's that it was all given from one person, and yet, through one person, and yet we have so many different opinions about it. Everybody reads things in their own way. And our job is to listen and create our own understanding, right? Based on what we hear from before, to be able to decide which opinion makes the most sense. Balashon Amal. Okay, so now that's the end of this beautiful, beautiful drasha about the importance of learning Torah. And you can see why Rabbi Yeshua responds with the following statement. Rabbi Yeshua said to his students, there is no generation that's considered orphaned if Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah is among them. In other words, wow, what a great, amazing scholar. So now the big question of this whole story is, why didn't they just say so explicitly? Mishum, right? Why did he have to prod them this whole time? Right? Prod is interesting with the whole thing of the prodder. Mishum ma'aseh shaya, because of another story that happened. What's this story? Ma'aseh beRabbi Yossi ben Dor Maskit, shalach lakbil pnei Rabbi Eliezer belod. Okay, some people have Rabbi Elazar, some people have Rabbi Eliezer. Likely it's Rabbi Eliezer ben Horkanus, which was known, number one, he was in Cherem because of the rabbis from the Tanu Rosh Halachnai story, the oven. And he was very, what we call a Kana'i, a zealous person, very strong-minded. So you see that from the story as well. There was a Maaseh Rabbi Yossi ben Dor Maskit, shalach lakbil pnei Rabbi Eliezer belod. So he went to his rabbi in Lod, Rabbi Eliezer. Amar lo, ma chidush haya bebeit midrash hayom. Now, instead of saying, oh, you're our rabbi, I drink from your waters. No, what does he say? Amar lo, nimnu v'gamru, amon u'moav maslim maaser ani b'shvit. He says, today in the Beit Midrash, they took a vote and they decided that the places inhabited now by Jews in Ammon and Moab, which are outside the borders of Israel, they take Maaser Ani on the Shemitah year. They don't keep laws of Shemitah, and instead they treat the Shemitah year like years 3 and 6, where you give tithes to the poor people. Amar lo Rabbi Yossi, pshot yadecha v'kabel einecha. Open your hands and get your eyes, meaning I'm taking your eyes out, you're going to be blinded. Catch your eyes because they're coming out of your head. He was very angry at him. It's not so clear why. Was it because he didn't first give a sign of respect? Okay, now you see why they didn't want to say anything, because look what happened in the last story, right? They said, we don't want that to happen to us. We don't want you to react the way Rabbi Eliezer did. So Some people say that from the continuation, you'll see why he was upset, because they took a vote on something that was already done way before. It was even considered to be a halacha l'moshe misinai. So how did they do that? So Amarlo, Yossi Pashat Yadav Kibel Einav. He puts out his hands, catches his eyes, basically he goes blind. Okay, which again, we had the ears in the previous story, we have the eyes in this story, all connecting to our topic. Bacha Rabbi Eliezer V'amar. He cried and he said. Now, some people say he cried because he was in Cherem, and had he not been in Cherem, he would have been in the Beit Midrash, and he would have been able to correct this big mistake that people didn't realize. Again, it wasn't a huge mistake. It was just, how can you say we're doing something that it was already done before you? Don't make yourselves into, oh, we're doing such a big deal because look what we did. But no. So now he said, Sod Hashem l're'avu brito lahodiam. God gives his secrets to those who fear him, meaning that they got in the end to the same answer. And they knew the right thing to do because God gave them his secrets, except they did something wrong because they didn't know that it was already done. So they were right in the end. He says it wasn't as terrible because they did the right thing. But Amarlo lechamor lahem al tachushu leminyanechem. Your whole voting is irrelevant. Kach mekublani Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai sheshama mirabo ve'rabo merabo. He's indicating the whole background. Hilchata lemoshe misinai. Amon Moab Masrim Maaser Ani B'Shvi'it Talach L'Moshe Misinai, that they're Masrim Maaser Ani B'Shvi'it. Matam, what's the reason? Harbe Krachim Kivshu Alei Mitzrayim V'lo Kivshu Molei Bavel. Mipnei Shekdusha Rishona Kitcha L'Shata V'lo Kitcha L'Atid Lavo. Okay, we'll stop mid-sentence. There were many cities that were captured by the Jews when they got out of Egypt, meaning Yoshua, when he came to capture the land, that weren't captured the second time. Okay? Now, when they captured the land in the time of Yoshua, they sanctified the land. But they say here, Kedusha Rishona Kitcha L'Shata, sanctified it for the moment, but not for the future, not going forward. Why didn't they conquer as many lands when they came back from Babylonia, the Babylonian exile? Because they didn't want to sanctify them all, because they said there's some problems with our system. Sometimes, if you go to the Tikkun Olam class that's going on right now, if you're not, you can sign up, you can register, you can get to it anytime. It's also recorded. It's Sundays in the month of February. And it sits on our course site, on our main site. You can find it on the courses tab. Anyway, the idea there is sometimes the halacha, it kind of clashes with reality. We have this idea of Shemitah. On the other hand, we have all these poor people who can't live because they can't grow crops that year. So what do? Just don't sanctify more places that could theoretically be in the bounds of Israel, but don't have to be, so that we can use that stuff to basically give food to the poor people in the Shemitah year. So that's why they did it. So he says, but that was halacha l'moshe misinai from a long time ago. Don't say that you did it yourselves. Tana, the Brighter says, la'achar shenit yashva da'ato amal, yihi ratzon shechzeru enei Yosef l'nkomam v'chazru. When everything came back, when he calmed down from being angry about this whole thing, he basically prayed that his eyes would come back, and they came back, and he was no longer blinded, he was healed. Okay, that's the end of that section. Now I remember what I wanted to say about couldn't remember before, but another reason why they might not have why they wanted to exempt these people from coming to the temple. So I think also you have to think about, again, we can see this from some sources. I'll give you an example, and then I'll explain what I want to say, which is there's al shalosh averot nashim metot b'shat leidatan. For 3 averot, women die in childbirth, right? Because they're not careful about challah, they're not careful about lighting candles, and they're not careful about laws of family purity. This is a very difficult statement to swallow. What does this mean? In understanding it, you have to understand their reality. They saw a lot of women dying in childbirth. And what the rabbis always like to do is they assumed if someone dies, it must be they did something wrong. So they try to connect. So in that way, they try to bring things that maybe women are more connected with, and they say maybe they weren't doing those things properly. It was a way, we look at this, it's hard to swallow what you're assuming someone sinned, but for them, it was a comfort. It was saying, the way of the world is supposed to work in a particular manner. If it doesn't, we assume it's because sin caused it, right? You see this in the Tanakh as well, right? This king died because he sinned, right? There's this, especially in Divrei Hayamim, in Chronicles, there's a lot of that, this connection between those things. I think also here, when they see someone who doesn't fit, who is missing, right? Can't hear in one ear, can't see in one eye, can't walk with one leg, right? All those things, they say, oh, that must be the hand of God. It must be a punishment. So maybe they viewed these people as these are people who are getting punished, right? Nowadays, we don't view it in that way. And even the rabbis, they talk all the time. And again, there's different different approaches, that you can't assume. We had at the end of the previous Masechet about Rabba and Rav Chisda. They were both great, and yet Rabba suffered terribly and Rav Chisda didn't at all. So you can't always connect, but I think it was a way of giving people a way to deal with how do we deal with the fact that we have this in our society. Again, it might not be that response that I would think would be the right response, but again, understanding things in their historical context, and they had a different way of thinking than we did. And sometimes we just have to accept that. And it's not a bad thing. It's just different. It was different society. It was a different way, right? Even 50 years ago, you had people with mental disabilities. They would put them in a I can't think of the word, but they would lock them up basically, in a psychiatric ward or something. They didn't know what to do with them. So things have changed in the last 50 years. Forget about what it was 2,000 years ago. So I think that that's a very helpful way to understand all this. And with that, we will end with this last section on a shoteh. What exactly is a shoteh? In the Koran, they translate as an imbecile. I never know exactly what the best word to translate a shoteh as. So we'll call him a shoteh in general. In English, here the Gemara is going to actually say, how do we define who is a shoteh? Tanu Rabbanan, ezehu shoteh. So they're bringing a braita that says, who is a shoteh? Hayotze yechidi balayla, one who goes out by himself at night or by herself, right? Nobody does that. Now, again, maybe locally, yes, but not in a place where there aren't people. Halam bebeit hakvarot, one who sleeps in a cemetery, which is creepy, right? Nobody wants to sleep in a cemetery. There was belief that also spirits there, people wouldn't want to do that, right? There were beliefs that there were shedim all around, evil spirits also in the cemetery lurking. V'hamakareya et ksuto, one who rips their clothing. Itma. So now there's a machloket. Rav Huna amar ad shu kulam bebat achad. You need all three of these at once, and then you know that they're a shoteh. Rabbi Yochanan amar afilu be'echad mehem, even one of them. So now we're going to go back to Rav Huna, and they're going to ask, hey chidami, what's the case? And they're going to say, you can do these things in a normal way, or you could do these things in a crazy way. So ida avilu derech shtut, if you do them, like it's clear you've lost your mind. Sometimes you see someone walking down the street, something's off, right? If it's clear they're doing it in a crazy manner, afilu b'chadanami. You shouldn't need three. One should be sufficient to say that you're a shoteh. Ida lo avilu derech shtut, if it's not done in that kind of way, afilu kulunami lo. Then even all of these things, if it was done, you had a good reason, a good justification. Well, then you're a normal person. You're not a shoteh. So la'olam deka'avilu derech shtut. So how do we explain it? You did it in a derech shtut, in a bit of an odd manner, but still there could have been a reason for it. Halam bebeit hakvarot, imor kadesh tishrei alav ruach tumah udeka'avin. Maybe you wanted some ruach tumah on you for some reason. Some people say maybe you wanted to engage in some sorcery, and you thought that if you sleep in the beit kvarot, you'll be able to do that. I wouldn't say you're totally normal if you want to do that, but somehow they thought that was okay. Hayotze yechidi balayla imor ganderifus achdei. Maybe he got some disease and he was hot fever inside. He wanted to go outside to cool off. One time my kid had the croup and they said, take him outside, like put him in a refrigerator in a really cold place, right? Open the freezer even and have him, that will help him, right? So maybe you needed to cool down or something. Hamikareya et ksuto, dilma imor bal machshavotu. Maybe he was just deep in his thoughts and he didn't pay attention, right? Sometimes kids always stick their shirts in their mouths and, people do things sometimes without paying attention to what they're doing. And all of a sudden you realize that you've torn, without even noticing what you were doing. That's people who like to fidget a lot. So kevan davdino lekulu. So these all could have a good reason to it, but since you did all three, it's like an ox that gored a camel, a donkey, and an ox. Any ox, we'll get to this in Bava Kama, who gores someone or an animal, gores 3 times, then, right, gores animals 3 different times. They're called a shor mu'ad, and they're already going to be liable. The owner's liable full damages. Before that, they're only liable half damages because he knows his ox was so crazy. But once he does it 3 times, it's clear that he's really a little crazy. And the owner should have watched him, and then the owner's fully responsible. But it doesn't matter if he gored an ox 3 times or a camel 3 times. If he did even one of each, that together there's 3. It doesn't matter that they're different. Likewise here, if the person did these 3 things, even though each one theoretically is separate and each one theoretically you could have an excuse and an explanation, but the fact that he did 3, that Rav Huna puts you in the category of a shoteh. With that, we will end our shiur for today. Have a Shabbat Shalom or Shavua Tov, everyone.